Beware, citizen, you are now departing from the world of allowable opinion. The Tom Woods Show.
Welcome, everybody. It is Wednesday, February 5th, 2014. Rolling Stone magazine says Karl Marx was right. Well, was he? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at this article over at Rolling Stone. Marx was right. 5 surprising ways Karl Marx predicted 2014 by what looks like a Sean McElwee. And we're going to go through point by point with our friend Peter Klein of the Mises Institute. Before we do that, let me just remind you guys of my upcoming events. March 1st, the College of Southern Idaho in Twin Falls, Idaho. Then Washburn University, March 5th in Topeka, Kansas. And March 15th, the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, Arkansas. I've got a couple more dates for the spring percolating, and I'll let you know when those are finalized. You can get the details about these events over at tomwoods.com/events. Let me bring on Peter Klein right now. Peter is the Carl Menger Research Fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Mises.org is the indispensable website, MISES.org. He's also Associate Professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri and the Director at the McQuinn Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership. He's also an Adjunct Professor at the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration. He's the author of 5 books, including The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur. And he holds a Ph.D. in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. It's my great pleasure to welcome to the program Peter Klein. Peter, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right, so I just told everybody about this crazy article in Rolling Stone. I wouldn't have known about it if somebody hadn't tweeted it to me, so the importance of Twitter can't be understated. I sometimes neglect Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Thomas E. Woods. Are you guys just at Mises? Is that your Twitter thing? Or
right, we're at Mises, and I also am on Twitter at Peter G. Klein, Klein.
All right, there you go. So follow all 3 of us after this program. That's the key thing. What I want to do is I want to go through point by point these 5 ways, 5 surprising ways that Karl Marx predicted 2014. And, you know, the articles like this, Peter, they're always written by insufferable jerks who want to say, you know, all you stupid peons think communism was a big failure, but that just shows you didn't understand it, man, you know? Because Marx he was like a smart guy, and he had a lot of great insights, and I'm going to share them with you, stupid rubes. So,
yeah, you know, the continuing fascination with characters like Marx, along with John Maynard Keynes, is, you know, itself a topic for another one of your shows. I mean, Marx could have easily just sort of slid into the dustbin of history, to use a Marxist phrase, but people continue to read his work, even though it's ponderous, tangentious, not particularly insightful. There's really not a whole lot of value in reading Marx, but people continue to do it, I think, because they like the conclusions that he reaches.
And I don't know, I probably will have to have a program at some point on Marx more generally, just because I'm tired of people who tell me, look, he was a great social scientist, and if you don't see that, then you haven't been reading him. But, I mean, talk about a guy whose system is just based on one fallacy and disprovable statement after another, that his own followers have to remake it to make it even remotely plausible.
Right. One thing that's interesting about this article is at the end, the author sort of recognizes that Marx is often misinterpreted as someone who, you know, developed a complete, coherent theory of socialism. As the author recognizes, and of course, as Ludwig von Mises pointed out, Marx said very little about socialism, and what he said is demonstrably false, both sort of on logical terms, as Mises approached it, and in on historical terms. But this author continues to make the argument that you often hear, that while Marx may have been incomplete or even wrong on socialism, he was a very perceptive analyst and thoughtful critic of capitalism. But I think Marx was neither of those.
Well, let's start with point number 1, the Great Recession, parentheses, capitalism's chaotic nature. So, of course, embedded in this already is a faulty assumption that part of capitalism is having central banks that do so. All right, here we go. I'm just going to read it. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, so we read this. The inherently chaotic, crisis-prone nature of capitalism, question-begging, I inserted that, was a key part of Marx's writings. He argued that the relentless drive for profits would lead companies to mechanize their workplaces, producing more and more goods while squeezing workers' wages until they could no longer produce the products they created. Now, I don't know, should we stop there? Because there's so much there I don't want to forget about. Let's stop there.
I mean, we can, sure. I mean, let me say on this article in general, and I guess you've provided the URL. If people want to check it out. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the whole thing, because what the author gives us is a mixture of, sort of very general statements from Marx that could be used to apply to almost anything, that aren't very specific, that aren't predictive at all, and, specific remarks of Marx that don't have anything to do with current reality. I mean, let's put it this way. Marx did not offer any comprehensive theory of economic crises. That Marx did not have a business cycle theory that was laid out in very specific detail, and certainly there's nothing at all in Marx's system that in any way, corresponds to the kind of business cycle that we're currently going through. A statement like the one you just read, that capitalism is inherently prone to crisis. Okay, fine. I mean, one could say that, and one might say, even an Austrian economist might say, that if by capitalism you mean our current state capitalism with central banking and cronyism and so forth, yeah, that is inherently unstable and is inherently crisis-prone. Ludwig von Mises would not disagree at all with a statement if that's what you meant by capitalism. So to claim from something like that, that Marx has sort of unique insight into, into the financial crisis and the ongoing recession is just sort of nonsensical.
Well, let's look at this. The second sentence is that the relentless drive for profits would lead companies to mechanize their workplaces, producing more and more goods while squeezing workers' wages until they could no longer purchase the products they created. Now, now you are a scholar of entrepreneurship. Isn't it the role of the entrepreneur to anticipate the level of consumer demand? And part of that anticipation is how much people can afford to buy. Isn't it the job of the entrepreneur to prevent that outcome?
Oh, of course. I mean, what entrepreneurs are doing, of course, in their relentless pursuit of profits is to try to produce the goods and services that consumers most value. And, of course, entrepreneurs want to pay the inputs into production as little as possible, right? They prefer to pay less to workers rather than more. But competition among entrepreneurs for the services of workers assures that wages will be, driven up to what, the Austrians call their marginal value products. In other words, labor, just like any other resource, gets paid according to its marginal contribution to production. Marx's whole idea was that there was this systematic long-term trend for real wages to fall as more and more of what he called the surplus value for production is extracted or exploited by the capitalists. I mean, that's completely the reverse of the historical experience, as you well know, in that real wages over the last 2 centuries have continued to rise in terms of what you can buy, the goods and services that one can buy with the money wages that are earned. So, as a long-term, sort of secular trend, this doesn't bear any relation to what we've seen at all.
In fact, Rolling Stone seems not to realize that one of the controversies among Marxist scholars has been how to reconcile this problem, this statement by Marx, this type of statement, with the obvious historical reality that the proletariat has not become immiserated, but has improved. So some of them have had to claim that what Marx meant was simply relative impoverishment, that they would actually get better off, but they wouldn't get better off as quickly as others. No. And this guy is just repeating the raw Marxist statement as if this debate hasn't even occurred.
Yeah, you raise a very good general point. I mean, of course, it's fun to talk about a Rolling Stone article, and, a lot more people will probably read this than would read some obscure academic article on Marx. But, I mean, it's as if the author is completely unaware of what's going on in contemporary Marxian scholarship. I mean, there are not lots, but there are, quite a few academic Marxists still around, and none of them would sort of cut and paste from Marx's words sort of out of context in this way. Contemporary Marxism is all about reinterpreting Marx, to as if he really meant things, as if what he meant was very different from what he actually wrote, to solve the problem that you just brought up, that everything that Marx, predicted about how capitalism would work, I mean, none of it corresponds at all with what capitalism actually does and what the historical experience has been, which is why, just as an aside, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but most of the interest in Marxist thought nowadays is not really among economists or historians, right, but critical legal theorists and among literary scholars and so forth who believe there's a kind of a cultural Marxism or a philosophic Marxism that may be useful for interpreting different social and cultural trends. But there's hardly any economist or economic historian who takes Marx very seriously anymore.
Well, when you read Marx, he actually suggests, and Rothbard focuses on this quite a bit, that it's as if the capitalist almost doesn't have a properly formed rational faculty, because Marx will claim that it's a mania to accumulate more and more capital. Why? For the sake of accumulation. Just keep accumulating, keep producing. But why would we assume they have no brain? I mean, let's assume though for a moment that they did have no brain, and all they did was just reflexively produce more and more and more and more and more and more and more, way beyond the point at which anybody would want a particular good. So you've got a glut of a particular good, and you don't have a whole lot of use for 800 million widgets. So what is the market response? What do you do then with your 800 million widgets to make sure they clear the market?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Marx really doesn't have any kind of theory of markets. There's nothing. There's no microeconomics, no sophisticated microeconomics in Marx, as you point out. His capitalists, but for that matter, his workers too. His his managers. I mean, all of the actors in Marx's system are modeled as just sort of part of a homogeneous class, acting in a mindless way according to class interest. There's not really any theory of individual choice. There's no sort of, rational or purposeful behavior. There's no understanding in Marx of the interconnectedness among different markets. Marx's analysis, it's almost a little bit pre-Keynesian in the sense that it focuses on these broad aggregates and proposes mechanisms among these aggregate categories of workers and resources and so on, without any kind of understanding of the sophisticated interrelationships among markets, among different types of economic actors, among different resource classes and so forth. So, I mean, it's kind of a sophomoric, cartoonish understanding of what an economy is like. Now, in Marx's defense, or what Marx's defenders have said is, yeah, but Marx wasn't really an economist in that sense. In the sense that we think of the Austrian school or even a Chicago-style economist. That wasn't what Marx was all about. He was doing sort of grand, sweeping social theorizing that doesn't have any, rigorous foundations in actual human behavior.
All right, let's return to just still in point number one. He says, we produce and produce until there's simply no one left to purchase our goods. Again, it doesn't bother to ask, why would someone do this, right? Why would somebody do this?
Right.
Then he says, the cycle is still playing out before our eyes. Broadly speaking, it's what made the housing market crash in 2008. Decades of deepening inequality reduced incomes, which led more and more Americans to take on debt. When there were no subprime borrowers left to scheme, the whole facade fell apart just as Marx knew it would. Now, there's so many things to say about that, but let me just introduce one quick thing before I turn it over to you. The whole thing we see from Gary North quite a bit about the Pareto Split, where he says that basically all societies, forever, everywhere in the world, makes no difference. There's always a 20-80 split, that the top 20% have 80% of the wealth. And then when you keep calculating, well, 20% of the 20% will have, and it just keeps going on, that in fact the so-called distribution of income we have now more or less conforms to that. So it's not like this is some brand new phenomenon that capitalism brought about. This has existed forever, and so because it has existed forever, it can't possibly be the explanatory factor behind one event in 2008. But what else do you have to say about this?
Oh, I agree with you completely. And as you well know, Tom, having written a book on the Great Recession, on the crash of 2008 and the subsequent recession, I mean, this isn't any kind of analysis. This doesn't fit in any way with what we know of the housing market, what went on in the last, in the 5 to 10 years prior to 2008. I mean, there certainly was no increase in mortgage debt corresponding with, quote, decades of deepening inequality. Subprime borrowers were not generally low-income individuals who were, suffering from decades of inequality. the malinvestment in the housing stock that, as Austrians understand, led to the crash and the subsequent recession and so forth, doesn't have anything to do with the kind of factors that are described in this quote. I mean, of course, you notice that the author doesn't stop to ask, well, where were the indebted borrowers getting these loans?
Ding, ding,
I
ding.
mean,
That's right.
Where was the money coming from? There's, of course, no Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke in the story. There's nothing about the government, regulations on housing, on borrowing, and so forth. I mean, again, this is just it's almost just inventing a sentence to try to link some idea in Marx to some very, very generic notion of a housing problem. It's as if the author said, okay, housing debt, I got to work that in somehow. I know that had something to do with the current problem. What did Marx say that could be connected to housing and debt? Without actually paying any attention to what happened in the 2000s.
Right.
There's no understanding of the financial crisis in here
or
in
no
this analysis at all.
Right, no attempt to understand individual motivations. Why would people have behaved in this reckless, speculative fashion when it came to real estate? Could it have had something to do with moral hazard created by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Could it have to do with moral hazard created by the Greenspan put? Could it be the false assurance created in 2001 when Greenspan just kept lowering interest rates, that housing prices never fall? Like, that didn't just occur. That was caused by government or government-created agencies.
Yeah, as you point out, I mean, you have to be able to. Your explanation has to fit the sequence of events in time, and this whole article is riddled with these sort of fallacies where you just sort of pick some general idea of Marx and imply that it explains something that's going on in the present without considering the timing whatsoever. I think it was Larry White who first said, or from whom I got the great quote that blaming the financial crisis on greed is like blaming a plane crash on gravity. In other words, if people were greedy, if capitalists were greedy, in 2006 and 2007, they were greedy before and they're greedy now. I mean, that doesn't just invoking greed. It's a bit like invoking, overproduction or invoking inequality as an explanation for some concrete historical event. It's just made up.
Yeah, and there have been there have been societies with vastly greater inequality where this hasn't happened. And in fact, on the eve of the Great Depression, there was not an increase in inequality going on. There was actually an increase in the share of incomes going to wages and salaries, and a relative fall in incomes going to interest and entrepreneurial income, et cetera. Now, the second point is, he says, the iPhone 5S, parentheses, imaginary appetite. So this is a very John Kenneth Galbraithian kind of criticism. Exactly.
I was thinking of Galbraith precisely as I read this paragraph.
So here's what he says. He says, Marx warned that capitalism's tendency to concentrate high value on essentially arbitrary products would over time lead to what he called, quote, a contriving and ever-calculating subservience to inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary appetites, unquote. He says, it's a harsh but accurate way of describing contemporary America, where we enjoy incredible luxury. But wait a minute, I thought we were all immiserated, right? I mean, we had all, didn't he just tell us that we've had inequality? But he says we enjoy incredible luxury, and yet are driven by a constant need for more and more stuff to buy. He says, consider the iPhone 5S you may own. Is it really that much better than the iPhone 5 you had last year or the iPhone 4S a year before that? Is it a real need or an invented one, et cetera? So this is, he says, we destroy perfectly good products for no reason. What do you say to that? I mean, why do I need an iPhone 5S when I got a perfectly good iPhone 5, Peter Klein?
There's a stereotype of Marxists as being sort of these grim and humorless types, who dress poorly and don't laugh at jokes and have unkempt hair and so forth. And I guess it's probably a good caricature because Marxism is infused with this very sort of patronizing attitude towards ordinary people. I mean, Marx despised ordinary people. Contemporary Marxists have nothing but contempt for, the masses, because the masses like to consume, and they like to consume all kinds of things that sophisticated, Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California Marxists would consider inappropriate. I remember a professor I once had who was not exactly a Marxist, but was sort of sympathetic to Marx, complaining to me about precisely this point, that people spend their money on the dumbest things, crass consumerism. People should be listening to classical music rather than Miley Cyrus, which, of course, I agree with that. They shouldn't be going to silly movies and so forth. They shouldn't be wearing dumb clothes. Well, gosh, I mean, you and I might agree with, we might share many aesthetic preferences with some of these, lefty types, but that has absolutely nothing to do with what rules we think should apply to a market system. Now, Marx was famous for embracing the labor theory of value. So Marx completely rejects rejects what we would now describe as the Austrian notion that value is subjective, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that it's impossible for us as outside observers to say which of a consumer's desires, wants, or needs are legitimate, which are illegitimate. But this is the mentality, again, the patronizing attitude that characterizes central planners, right? That Marx and the Marxists want to say what human needs are legitimate and what needs are illegitimate, and they dislike a system in which ordinary people are free to spend their hard-earned income the way, on what they want. And if people think an iPhone 5 is better than an iPhone 4, there's certainly no scientific principle that would allow us to say, well, no, but Tom, you would really be better off if you had spent that money on, a new suit or on a pair of shoes or on a trip to the Grand Canyon or whatever. There's no scientific principle by which one can determine which individual wants or needs are sort of more legitimate than others.
Well, and of course, and with Galbraith, there is the implication that human beings are really like zombies who are just waiting to be manipulated by the next advertising campaign that will elicit from them the desire to go buy a product they wouldn't have cared about or known about or felt the need for if it hadn't been for this advertising campaign manipulating them. But as Rothbard pointed out in his critique of Galbraith, if that were true, then we wouldn't have business firms spending as much as they do on marketing research to figure out what consumers want. If all you need to do is make a slick advertisement and people will just automatically buy whatever you contrive or whatever you subliminally indicate they need to buy, they would be a lot happier. They didn't have to spend this money figuring out what the heck these inscrutable consumers want.
Yeah, and why would any firms ever go bankrupt, right? They can just persuade people to buy whatever sort of crap they're producing.
Especially today, with YouTube, just make a free ad, and everybody will go buy your product.
I mean, speaking of Galbraith, Rothbard also pointed out, that Galbraith's view that, all phones are basically the same and, all automobiles are basically the same. People just think they're different because they're tricked by clever advertising, is actually the reverse of the truth, right? To people who don't know anything about cars and don't care about cars, well, a car is just basic transportation. It's four wheels and a steering wheel, and you don't really distinguish one from another. But if you're a car enthusiast, if you're a car buff, if you're a car expert and you really study carefully automobiles and the automobile industry and you race cars or you show cars or whatever, then you're very, carefully attuned to subtle differences among different products within a category. In other words, the more you know about something, the more you realize how different members of the category are. The less you know about it, you think it's all just sort of the same. So it's not that advertising convinces you that there are differences, makes you believe in differences that really aren't there. The more you know about the product, the more attuned to the actual differences you are.
So we're on number 3 out of 5. Number 3 says the IMF, parentheses, the globalization of capitalism. So we read the I'm going to read the paragraph, then we'll comment on it. And of course, again, it assumes that the IMF is part of capitalism. The IMF is funded by governments, so by definition, it's not part of the nexus of voluntary exchange. So again, we just have a category mistake here. So we read this. Marx's ideas about overproduction led him to predict what is now called globalization, the spread of capitalism across the planet in search of new markets. And he quotes Marx as saying, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere, unquote. While this may seem like an obvious point now, Marx wrote those words in 1848 when globalization was over a century away. And he wasn't just right about what ended up happening in the late 20th century. He was right about why it happened. The relentless search for new markets and cheap labor, as well as the incessant demand for more natural resources, are beasts that demand constant feeding. Now, we'll leave out the IMF because he's just using that as a catch-all phrase because each one of these points he has a cutesy little title for. So he thinks the IMF embodies Right.
He thinks his readers will bristle at IMF.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They don't really know what it is, but it's probably pretty bad. And, of course, the International Monetary Fund, the monetary aspect of the monetary fund, is all based on money that is government supplied. Like, there's nothing capitalistic about it other than it involves money. So they feel like, well, I know capitalism has money. Like, my Monopoly board game has a lot of money in it. So this must be capitalism. All right, forget the IMF, though, because he doesn't really mention the IMF. What's the deal here? How would you evaluate? I mean, you especially, somebody who talks a lot about the firm, industrial organization, etc. What's your reaction to what I just read?
Yeah, it's so funny on a number of levels. I mean, first, the idea that Marx was really prescient in 1848 by explaining that the trade occurs across international boundaries. The idea that somehow novel would shock people of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and of course anyone familiar with international trade, which, had been going on for a couple of centuries at least before Marx was writing. So, I mean, there's certainly nothing particularly insightful about this idea. But what's funny is, think about the way Marx puts it. I mean, imagine that you're an impoverished consumer on some remote part of the world in sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe or the Americas, right? And all of a sudden, here come ships loaded with goods from another place that are available for you to trade, things that you could not get or you could not produce or obtain in any way in your home region, and you can take goods that you can produce efficiently and effectively, and you can exchange them with people far away for goods that they produce efficiently and effectively, and you can realize these gains from trade. The principle of comparative advantage developed by Ricardo in the 18 teens and so forth. To Marx, this is like an invasion, right? It's like if a ship pulled up on shore and they open up the holds, and instead of armies coming out, there are merchants coming out with goods and services they want to offer, to me in exchange. This is like the plague to Marx. This is like a horrible military conquest. Of course, global trade makes people better off, as Adam Smith and David Ricardo and their predecessors and their followers all perfectly well understood, and Marx did not. This idea that globalization represents sort of conquest by imperialistic firms that are, acquiring new territories and compelling people to trade with them, of course, is absolutely ludicrous. Now, it should be said that many of the large trading firms of Marx's day were government-connected monopolies. Marx would, of course, wanted all trading to be conducted by government-controlled monopolies. But, of course, this is a very small fraction of globalization, sort of global trade as a whole. So, but there's just nothing in here at all that has anything to do with international markets, with global exchanges of labor and goods. Those are all for the good. Those all make people better off, and not just in a trivial sort of academic way, but many people who would otherwise have died of mass starvation in the developing world have survived and indeed prospered, and their standards of living have increased rapidly precisely because of this thing, globalization, that is such anathema to Marxists and other, left-wing critics of capitalism.
And, of course, Marx always uses kind of military imagery, as you say, to refer to normal market exchange, and it leaves the reader with the impression that something sinister is going on here, that capitalism just irrationally drives people to go all over the world doing their sinister work. But when you peel away the crazy rhetoric and you just try to think about it normally, what's actually going on is that there are a lot of people in the world and they have a lot of needs. And we have to think of new and more efficient and less costly ways of meeting those needs. Yeah. Like, that's really what's happening. That's all.
That's right. Look at Marx's wording. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. I mean, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
It's like an octopus.
It's an octopus, right. Yeah.
Grabbing people and squeezing them. Of course, this is, it's almost like philanthropy. I mean, these are, these capitalists are going around the world offering to make people's lives better. And, that's a horrible thing to Marx.
And, of course, what would a modern company be doing? I mean, let's say, like, I don't know, 85% of modern companies, who's their natural target audience? Whom are they appealing to? The mass market. I mean, almost every firm is trying to produce things for the general public. So they're trying to think of ways to satisfy not the desires of Queen so-and-so who wants a new diamond necklace, but they're trying to satisfy somebody who wants a toaster or somebody who just wants to improve his life in some way that doesn't impress a Cambridge Marxist professor, but will, in fact, marginally improve the standard of living of an average person.
Oh, that's absolutely right. I mean, the elites always do well under any system of social organization, including communism. It's the masses who have the most to gain in relative terms from capitalism as opposed to socialism. And, just to sort of segue into point number 4 about Walmart, Walmart is, it's supposed to be a dirty word. When a Marxist hears Walmart, his ears sort of prick up right away. But just as you said, Walmart, the greatest beneficiary of Walmart is not some wealthy, shareholders. It's the consumers of Walmart. I mean, Walmart is a store that caters to low-income consumers, that employs low-skill, relatively low-skilled individuals. I mean, Walmart is the greatest, benefactor of the least well-off people in America, of any major corporation, but you wouldn't expect the Marxists to understand that or to appreciate it.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, Walmart has taken a vast network of distribution of goods and broken it up into a bunch of different occupations that a lot of average people can perform because it's been so well mechanized that somebody who couldn't possibly conceive of the problems at stake can press a few buttons and play an important role in this overall structure. And the complaint is these people aren't being paid enough. If there were somebody out there who thought this person could better serve the public in my firm, they would have been hired by that firm. If Walmart is hiring them at all, it means this is the only person that thought my labor is worth something. Why would that be the outfit that you would be critical of? Why aren't you critical of all the firms that didn't hire these people at all? I know that's not the point of the article, but I always wonder about that. Why is the one outfit that gets criticized the outfit that actually employed the person and not all the other greedy outfits that are paying them $0 an hour?
Yeah, again, it's snobbery. It's a patronizing attitude. Most of these writers, the people who are, they're writing from New York City or, L.A., they've never even been to a Walmart, much less, have regularly depended on a Walmart for their goods and services. I mean, they're snobs, they're elitists, and of course my gosh, this company is headquartered in Arkansas. I mean, how much more sort of, socially irresponsible can you be? They don't even have a good dinner theater, near Walmart's headquarters. I think it's pure elitism and snobbery and a failure to recognize that companies like Walmart are huge benefactors of the least well-off. And by the way, what the author's trying to argue here is somehow that the existence of Walmart validates Marx's prediction that capitalism would come to be dominated by these sort of big monopoly firms. I mean, that in itself is, again, it's just a completely invented assertion. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of big companies like Walmart. Walmart has a large market capitalization. It's made very effective use of economies of scale. Microsoft is a large corporation. General Motors is a large corporation. There are lots of large corporations in the U.S., but and around the world. But overall, there has been absolutely no increase in sort of average rates of concentration since Marx's time. In many industries, in many cases, industries are much less concentrated than they were in Marx's day. They're more competitive, using that term in sort of the conventional sense of having, lots of firms doing different things and experimenting and so forth. So again, this is just, there's so many fallacies here, it's hard to pick them out, but this is just sort of arguing by anecdote. I mean, yes, there is a large company. Somehow that is supposed to validate Marx's idea, quote, that market power would actually be centralized in large monopoly firms as businesses increasingly preyed upon each other. I mean, that just doesn't correspond to reality in any way.
Well, let me read the sentence in here that really, in point number 4, that really gets to the heart of his claim. He says, today, mom-and-pop shops have been replaced by monolithic big-box stores like Walmart. Small community banks have been replaced by global banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, although obviously that has nothing to do with capitalism because the whole banking system is a cartel structure under the Federal Reserve, which is a creation of Congress, and the money is supported by legal tender. It's monopolistic through and through. It's a cartel. It's nothing like the free market. And then small farmers have been replaced by the likes of Archer Daniels Midland. Well, I mean, there are aspects of that story where I think there are ways that that agriculture subsidies may have contributed to that. But right. I think these are, though, I mean, I know you say this is anecdotal, but this is what a lot of people come face to face with every day. These are things people see. Now, what you may be talking about is going to sound very surprising to people, that, in fact, average concentration rates are no higher than before. But people aren't likely going to come across that because you'd have to read a scholarly article in a journal somewhere, an obscure source, even to be aware of it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But, I mean, I think it's easier for people to understand it this way. I mean, suppose you live in a community where, you know, in your grandparents' day or your parents' day, there were, 25 little mom-and-pop shops downtown, and now most of them are boarded up, and because there's a Walmart and a Best Buy and a Home Depot on the periphery of town. I mean, so if you're only looking within the geographic constraints of your little town, it may very well be that there are a small number of big box stores and all these other mom and pop stores aren't there anymore. But there's two ways in which that's the wrong way to measure competition, right? I mean, the total amount of goods and services that are available to you would be vastly higher in that case than what you get in the mom and pops. It's not that the Walmarts and the Best Buys are simply displacing the mom and pops in cases like that, but they're offering vastly more goods and services than the mom and pops collectively offered before the big box stores came about. The second point is, have these people never heard of something called the Internet?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, capitalism, globalization, the fact that even if you live in a small town and there's only one store, within a 25-mile radius, if you have access to the Internet and there are streets, that a UPS truck can drive upon, you have a huge set of global companies at your fingertips, just a few clicks away. So measured that way, things are much more competitive than they ever were in Marx's day.
Right, and not only do you have giant companies at your fingertips, you have a huge array of tiny little companies at your fingertips on the Internet. And in particular, a lot of those are fostered by a major corporation like Amazon through its Amazon marketplace. And it's as if none of these things exist at all, according to this article. And incidentally, Peter, you get the sense when you hear criticisms like this that anybody who makes the argument, as you and I do, that the array of consumer goods is vastly greater and there's a more diverse array of consumer goods, that people who say this are really just stupid, materialistic dolts who don't understand that there are things more important in life than your crummy consumer goods. So let me translate that into something that maybe people can appreciate more vividly. My own wife grew up extremely poor. I mean, her family was poor to a degree that most people can't imagine, and it meant something that they could go to Walmart and get inexpensive children's clothing. I mean, literally, so they could clothe their children. You know what? That is not just, I need to have the most recent frippery in order to satisfy my desire for conspicuous consumption.
That's
no,
right.
This was a real, living, breathing family whose standard of living was vastly improved because they weren't being ripped off every time they wanted to buy a onesie for an infant.
Yeah, that's right. Now, there's a lot of this sort of phony nostalgia about, walking into the old hardware store and being able to chat up the proprietor, and he'd ask you, how's your mother-in-law doing, and so forth. I mean, two things to note about that. First of all, in most cases, those mom-and-pop stores were charging very high prices compared with what you would pay now, and lots of people simply could not afford to patronize those mom and pops. And if you were relatively well-to-do, you could stroll down the main street and have a cup of tea and chit-chat with the butcher and so forth, but that was not in the interest of the community as a whole. And the second point is, there's nothing at all in a free market system that says people can't have little main streets and they can't have small artisan shops. The point is you have to pay for it. It has to be priced out. Right? If people are willing to pay higher prices for that kind of shopping experience, then by all means there will be plenty of entrepreneurs willing to provide little shops like that. And, of course, we see those. There are lots of, artisan bakeries and butcher shops and organic restaurants and so on are flourishing as never before. As, supply chains have become more efficient, you can order off the Internet. It's a lot easier to provide those kinds of things than it was before. So the fact that Walmart sets up somewhere, nearby by no means prevents people who are willing to pay for it to have whatever kind of cutesy and fun shopping experience they desire.
All right, let's jump to point number 5. Low wages, big profits, parentheses, the reserve army of industrial labor. Again, I'm going to just read the paragraph and then get your comments. So we read this. Marx believed that wages would be held down by a reserve army of labor, which he explained simply using classical economic techniques. Capitalists wish to pay as little as possible for labor, and this is easiest to do when there are too many workers floating around. Thus, after a recession, using a Marxist analysis, we would predict that high unemployment would keep wages stagnant as profits soared, because workers are too scared of unemployment to quit their terrible, exploitative jobs. And what do you know? No less an authority than the Wall Street Journal warns, quote, lately the U.S. recovery has been displaying some Marxian traits. Corporate profits are on a tear, and rising productivity has allowed companies to grow without doing much to reduce the vast ranks of the unemployed, unquote. That's because workers are terrified to leave their jobs and therefore lack bargaining power. It's no surprise that the best time for equitable growth is during times of full employment, when unemployment is low and workers can threaten to take another job. Okay, what's your response to that?
It's hard to know what to say to that. There's so many things one could note. First you might say, okay, if it is true as the author states that quote, capitalists wish to pay as little as possible for labor, and this is easiest to do when there are too many workers floating around, then how did we ever get a boom in the first place? Recession means conditions have gotten worse from they were in a previous period of higher employment. Is it that capitalists, they wanted to pay workers higher wages, and so they had higher incomes and more to spend, and this led to some kind of general prosperity, and then all of a sudden employers changed their minds and decided they wanted to get greedy and wanted to start paying workers less? How do you get a business cycle out of this kind of analysis? That's point number one. Point number two, this whole idea of the reserve army of the unemployed, again, it's just a complete fabrication of Marx's imagination. There's no Marx doesn't have any theory of what determines wages. If it's the truth that, Marx thinks that wages are determined by some sort of, coercive bargaining between wealthy, powerful capitalists and poor and sort of unorganized workers. But again, then why would wages rise and fall over time? How do you explain differences in wages across industries? How do you explain the fact that, workers with more skills and more education earn higher wages than similar workers with fewer skills and less education and experience, even if they belong to the same union or work in the same industry? There's nothing in Marx's analysis that can explain anything of any sort of actual patterns of wage profiles over time or across worker types or across industries or whatever. Again, as we said before, Marx rejected any sort of micro foundations of his kind of analysis, so he would reject the notion, the contemporary correct notion, right, that wages are determined by marginal productivity. And so, Marx has nothing else to use to explain wages that he personally thinks are too low, so he invents this notion of the reserve army of the unemployed and the greedy capitalists who are refusing to pay their workers what they deserve, or unions that aren't powerful enough, or whatever. Again, there's no theory of earnings in here whatsoever, no theory of wages, and certainly no theory of recessions.
So, having looked at all 5 of these things, what do you think is the greatest, most common misconception about the market that we've seen and hear, that you think the general public has, that if we could overturn it, it would go a long way to tumbling all the other misconceptions?
Yeah, maybe the most obvious kind of general fallacy that Marx adhered to was this notion that we can explain economic outcomes in terms of relationships among these broad and sort of static categories of individuals, right? Labor versus capital, financiers versus assembly line workers and this sort of thing. that isn't how an economy works, right? This sort of crude aggregationist fallacies. And especially in a modern economy, we were talking about Walmart earlier. Well, the workers of Walmart, wage-earning individuals, they're part of labor, I guess, right? I mean, the management at Walmart, most of these people are on wages and salaries. They're also part of labor. I mean, the earnings of Walmart do not go into the hands of the few oligarchs, right? I mean, the profits that Walmart earns are paid out to Walmart shareholders as dividends. And who are the shareholders of Walmart? Well, you and me, right? I mean, corporate stock ownership has never been as widely dispersed as it is today in the United States. Most ordinary working people that have any kind of retirement savings, 401ks, whatever, I mean, they're the capitalists who are getting the money from Walmart. So the laborers, the managers, the capitalists, the investors, and in many senses the entrepreneurs, these are all the same people. Right? All people perform multiple functional roles in the economy, and over time, throughout their lives, they may, perform predominantly one and then predominantly another. There's lots of mobility horizontally and vertically in a modern capitalist industrial economy. So the idea that, at birth, you're born into some sort of rigid caste, I guess maybe this is, reflects Marx's his environment in 19th century Britain. And he really thought there was this kind of rigid class system, which doesn't have anything to do with a market economy, theoretically or empirically.
Peter, I'm going to let you go at this point. You've been extremely generous with your time, being here for 2 programs to talk about these points. But even though Marxism as a system is probably dead, the fallacies live on, and they live on and they burn in the hearts of people who I think just love to show how much better and smarter they are than everybody else. Because, look, you all think this guy was a stupid head, but that's just because you're too stupid to see all the nuggets of wisdom in him. And I think we took care of this guy pretty nicely in the last couple of programs, thanks to you. So thanks for being here.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Tom.
All right, everybody, that was Peter Klein. I hope you guys will check out and support the Mises Institute, MISES.org. Make sure and subscribe to this program via iTunes or Stitcher. We release a new program every weekday, Monday through Friday, via those means, and you can subscribe very easily via the links that you'll find at tomwoodsradio.com. And you can hear the program streaming for the first time every weekday at tomwoodsradio.com at noon Eastern. Tomorrow on this program, it's Mike Church of The Mike Church Show on Sirius XM. A real hero of mine, a great guy, and you'll love hearing from him, I know. And please remember, you are helping me pay the bills here at The Tom Woods Show at no cost to yourself every time you make an Amazon purchase by first entering Amazon via the Amazon widget you will see at tomwoodsradio.com. Just make sure you don't have an ad blocker or you won't see it. But just head over to tomwoodsradio.com, enter Amazon from there, and you are helping me out, and I really, really appreciate that. Hope you guys are enjoying the program. We'll see you tomorrow.
The Tom Woods Show.